In this lecture, we'll begin talking about Abraham and the lives of the patriarchs. And in this short little lecture, we're really going to emphasize just the first 3 verses of Genesis 12 because they're so important. And so let's just look at that text right now. As we look at Genesis 12, let's read it together, and I want to draw a few things out for you. It says in Genesis 12, 1 through 3, "Now the Lord said to Abram, 'Go from your country and from your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you. And I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great, so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and him who dishonors you I will curse, and in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed.'" Now, this is a 3-fold promise given to Abraham. And you remember I had a little chart that I said would show up a lot for Genesis 3:15. This same chart is going to show up a lot as well. And it's just, again, land, nation, blessing. All it is this little square that reminds us that these are the things that are promised to Abram. And when we consider the promise that is actually given to him, there are 2 main things that we need to focus in on. The first is how it relates to the seed promise from Genesis 3:15. And the second is that this is an unconditional covenant, not a conditional one. So let's take that first one right now. When we think about the seed promise and how it relates here, this is really important because it says in the text that Abram will bless, through him, all the nations will be blessed. And this is a really important promise. And actually, we see this fulfilled by the end of the book of Genesis, that through Abram's family, the nations of the world are blessed because Joseph provides food for all the world during a famine. And so in the contained book of Genesis as a single story, we see that this actually happens. But in the broader sense of the nations being blessed through Abram, we actually have a clue for what this means from Paul in the book of Galatians. And what it says is this. In Galatians 3:8, it says, "The scripture announced the gospel in advance to Abram. All the nations will be blessed through you." And so maybe when we first think about what the promise given to Abram means is that maybe directly through him, God gives blessing to Abram, and then that goes down to the nations from there. But in the book of Genesis, it actually goes a little bit further than that. It's not through Abram, and it's not through his descendant or the descendant after that, but it's through Joseph that the nations of the earth are blessed. And so we do see it happen. We actually do see Abram have the chance to bless the nations as well. So this is a promise that keeps coming up again and again and again. But what Paul does is he interprets for us, and he says, well, the offspring that will actually bring that blessing is Jesus. And so Jesus is the ultimate fulfillment of this. That blessing is given to Abram, and through many generations of descendants, this promise goes until ultimately Jesus Christ is the blessing to all of the nations. This is very similar to what we saw in Genesis 3:15 in that promise, where although on the surface in the actual text it doesn't necessarily seem to be a strong messianic promise, it has its ultimate fulfillment in Jesus. Now, this one's a little bit different because although the concept is similar, Paul actually does say specifically in the New Testament that this does find its fulfillment in Jesus. And so this is the first important thing to realize, that these promises relate, that it's not necessarily that Genesis 3:15 and Genesis 12, 1 through 3 are separate promises, but rather that they build upon each other. And we'll see this continue to happen throughout the Old Testament, that there is this kind of base promise in Genesis 3:15, and on top of that, because of that, we can have this promise given to Abram in Genesis 12, 1 through 3. Now, the second thing we need to consider is that this is an unconditional covenant. And I've highlighted 2 words here for us, now and. And maybe this isn't going to be super clear, but let's read it anyway. It says, "Now the Lord said to Abram, 'Go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you, and I will make of you a great nation.'" And I have a note here. It says, "now and" versus "if then." Now, there's a way that this could have been phrased, and that is "if then." If, Abram, you go, then I will give you this promise. But that's not how it's phrased. It says now and. And I hope you don't think that I'm just trying to act smart here and say, well, look at these certain words are used. In the Hebrew grammar, there's actually a certain construction that's used here that does not indicate that if-then statement. It's not like a conditional says, if you do this, then this will happen. It's more like that first one. It is more like the promise is given and it's there for the taking. All he has to do is take it. There's no conditions put on it. The only condition is that he takes it, really. And if I'm thinking of an example of how this might work, I could say that I make a batch of chocolate chip cookies, and they're delicious and they're warm, and I put them on the counter and I say to my children, the cookies are there. All you have to do is go and get them, right? So there is kind of a condition there, but not really. They don't see that as burdensome. It just means that all they have to do is get them. They're free, there's nothing attached, they don't have to do chores to get the cookies. All they have to do is go and take them. And that's really similar to how this promise is phrased, or this covenant is phrased. Sometimes people will say it's not a conditional statement, but it is conditioned. And all that means is what I've said, that the only condition is that he goes and takes it, and he does do that. But it's not based upon his actions or anything that he does. And we're going to move ahead to show why this is the case even more clearly. So let's move ahead to Genesis chapter 15. Now in Genesis 15, this is a kind of a weird text, especially if you don't really understand what's going on, but it is so significant. So in Genesis 15, this is where God comes back to Abram and he renews this covenant, or he kind of gives more information about the covenant. And he says, here's what I want you to do, Abram. I want you to take a bunch of animals, I want you to cut them in half, and then we'll see what happens. And what happens is that he puts Abram to sleep, and then God, in the form of a flaming fire pot, walks through the middle of those animals. Well, this, like I said, is really weird if you don't understand it, but if you do, it's so significant. So I have a little picture here, just a little illustration, and I want you to consider what this would be like. In the ancient Near East, I use the acronym ANE, just means Ancient Near East. And you'll see this again and again in Old Testament studies. It just means the same time as the Old Testament. What was going on? Well, in the ancient Near East, this was a common way to picture a contract. So let's say me and my friend, we are going to have a contract. And so what happens is I say, look, I'm going to do this, and you're going to do this. And then we cut up these animals, and we walk through the middle of them. Well, why would we do that? I think if you're doing it, it seems a little bit more obvious. As we walk through here, basically what we're saying is if I don't keep my end of the bargain, I'm going to end up like these animals. And you're actually walking through the blood, as you can imagine, just looking at this picture. You're actually walking through this blood saying, I'm going to complete this contract, my end of the deal, or I'm going to end up like these animals. It's a very visual and visceral picture of what's actually being agreed to. But as I mentioned before, Genesis 15 is different. What happens is not what we expect. We expect that Abram will cut up the animals, and then Abram and God will walk through these cut up animals together, and they'll both agree to their conditions in this contract, and then they'll have a deal. But that's not what happens. What happens is far more powerful. Instead, what happens is God puts Abram to sleep, and he goes through the middle without Abram. Well, what does this mean? It means that this is an unconditional covenant. Instead of going through with Abram and having him say, this is what I agreed to do, God goes through and he does it alone. And this is an unconditional covenant. It just means that God is not putting any stipulations on it. He is saying, doesn't matter what you do, Abram, I am in charge of keeping this deal. And I am going to fulfill it no matter what you do. And actually, as we look at the life of Abram, that's what we see over and over and over again. So this is really important in understanding what kind of a covenant this is, and even how it relates to that original promise. That promise given in Genesis 3:15 didn't say, if you guys do this, then I'll send this deliverer. But it's just given as saying, this is what will happen. And so this significance of this covenant is so big. We're going to come back to this again and again and again because it relates to so many other things and so many other promises.